A millionaire tries to buy a humble farmer's land but fails. When he investigates the farmer's story, his life changes forever.
Before we start the story, write in the comments where you're watching from.
Thomas Carter walked along the fence of his farm, inspecting the worn-out wire. There was something comforting about manual labor, tasks that required little more than strength and patience. He had purchased the land 2 years ago, a secluded piece in rural Montana, seeking the kind of solitude that erased faces and voices. Here no one asked questions. No one knew who he was. No one knew what he had lost. The dust rising from a car on the dirt road caught his attention. Visitors were rare, especially those driving a sleek, polished SUV that looked out of place in the rural landscape. He stopped by the fence, leaning on the weathered wood as the car pulled up in front of the house. An elegant man stepped out, adjusting his jacket as if every detail mattered. Thomas didn't move. He simply watched. "Mr. Carter," the man called out loudly. His voice practiced to sound friendly. "Ethan Sterling. Sorry to drop by unannounced, but I needed to speak with you personally." Thomas didn't respond immediately. He observed Ethan the way a farmer watches a fox circling the henhouse. Slowly, he adjusted his hat to block the sun and said, "You're talking." Ethan let out a short laugh, probably expecting a different reaction. He took a few steps toward Thomas but stopped short of invading his space. Reaching into the inner pocket of his jacket, he pulled out a thick envelope and held it out with a confidence that seemed rehearsed. "I've learned this land belongs to you now. And I've also heard no one's made good use of it before. I want to buy it, Mr. Carter. And I'm willing to pay very well." Thomas stayed silent. He didn't look at the envelope. He didn't look directly at Ethan. He seemed more interested in the sky, where a hawk was drawing lazy circles on the horizon. Finally he said, "Not for sale." Ethan blinked, as if he hadn't heard correctly. "Mr. Carter, perhaps I wasn't clear. I'm talking about an offer that few would refuse. I believe the figure inside will change your perspective." He shook the envelope slightly, pressing the point. Thomas finally looked at him, his gaze steady and direct. "I didn't buy this place to sell it." Ethan forced a smile. He wasn't used to rejection, much less one so swift. "Look, I understand. This land may hold sentimental value for you perhaps. But honestly, what I'm offering can change your life. Can give you something bigger." Thomas gripped the fence wire with his calloused fingers, feeling the roughness against his skin. "My life already changed. And money wasn't what did it." Ethan hesitated. He was used to negotiating with resistance, but there was something different about this man. Something unyielding. He stepped back, taking a deep breath. "All right, I won't press. For now. But I want you to think about it, Mr. Carter." He left the envelope on the fence, his mouth curling into an almost challenging smile. "I'll be back." Thomas simply stood there, watching as the black car kicked up dust on its way down the road. When the road grew quiet again, he picked up the envelope, stared at it for a moment, and without opening it, tossed it into the rusted bed of an old truck that hadn't run in years. Meanwhile, Ethan wasted no time. On the drive back, he picked up his phone and called Vince, his private investigator. He was brief. "Look into the history of this farmer. Get back to me as soon as possible." In the following days, Ethan was impatient. He paced back and forth in his office, phone in hand, waiting for Vince's return call. So far, there was no concrete information about Thomas Carter, and it gnawed at him. Ethan wasn't a man who handled uncertainty well. Clenching his fist on the desk, Ethan took a deep breath and made a decision. He wouldn't wait any longer. Negotiation was his strength, and whatever was keeping that farmer tied to the land, $50 million would surely break through any resistance. Grabbing his keys, he left the office, determined, and drove straight to Montana. When he arrived at the farm, the sky was already heavy with dark clouds, and a cold wind had begun to blow. Thomas was exactly where Ethan expected him to be, by the fence, calmly inspecting the pasture. When the SUV came to a stop, Thomas looked up but showed no sign of surprise. "You again," Thomas said, wiping his forehead with his arm. Ethan stepped out of the car, this time without a jacket. He walked straight toward Thomas, stopping beside the fence. "Yes, it's me again. And this time, I've brought an offer you won't refuse." Thomas leaned slightly on the fence, resting his hands on the wood. "Interesting. What's this miracle offer?" Ethan pulled a document from his folder and placed it on the fence as though placing all his bets. $50 million. Thomas raised an eyebrow, but his face remained expressionless. He glanced at the paper but made no move to touch it. "That's a lot of money." "It doesn't seem like it." "It is," Ethan said, crossing his arms. "This could change your entire life. You could do anything. Go anywhere." Thomas let out a sound that was somewhere between a short laugh and a sigh. He looked Ethan directly in the eye. His expression one of finality. "Money isn't going to convince me, Sterling. My life isn't a number. I didn't buy this land to sell it, and certainly not to you." Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but before he could respond, a clap of thunder rolled across the sky. Rain began to fall almost instantly, a dense, cold curtain that turned the dry ground into mud within seconds. Thomas stepped back, pulling his hat down over his head. "You're wasting your time out here. Come inside before you end up looking like a wet poodle." Reluctantly, Ethan followed him up to the porch and then inside the house. As soon as he entered, he was struck by the emptiness around him. The house was simple, Spartan. A wooden table sat at the center, surrounded by chairs that looked decades old. An unused fireplace dominated the main wall, and the only decoration was an old, dusty photo on a nearby shelf. "I wasn't expecting luxury, but this is minimalism taken to a whole new level," Ethan remarked, shaking water off his jacket. Thomas walked to the kitchen, grabbed a bottle of water, and tossed it to Ethan without commenting. Leaning against the counter, he crossed his arms. "Why do you insist so much on this land? Surely there are easier places for you to buy." Ethan opened the bottle, but before he could answer, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out quickly and saw Vince's name on the screen. Finally, he muttered, "Are you going to answer, or are you waiting for a dramatic moment?" Thomas quipped, sitting down in one of the chairs. Ethan raised the phone to his ear. "Go ahead, Vince." "I found what you wanted," Vince began, his voice tense. "Thomas Carter isn't just some ordinary farmer. He used to own a multimillion-dollar tech company. He sold everything 2 years ago and donated almost all of the money. He only kept enough to buy that farm." Ethan narrowed his eyes, intrigued. "Why? What happened?" "It seems he was in a car accident. Lost his wife and daughter. Police reports say he was distracted, texting on his phone when it happened. He feels responsible. Since then, he's walked away from everything." Ethan was silent for a long moment, absorbing the words. He glanced at Thomas, who seemed perfectly calm, as if he already knew what was being said on the other end of the line. "I understand, Vince," Ethan said finally, hanging up the phone. He slipped it back into his pocket, but his mind was racing. He couldn't look at Thomas the same way anymore. The rain didn't let up, pounding on the roof as if trying to force the house to cave in. Ethan sat at the table, his elbows resting on the surface, his head low. The night had dragged on, and exhaustion was beginning to weigh him down. Across the room, Thomas leaned against the counter, silent, as if waiting for Ethan to break the quiet first. Then Ethan's phone buzzed again. He picked it up and saw a familiar name flashing on the screen. For a moment he hesitated. Answering felt like a chore, but ignoring it wasn't an option. He stood and walked to the window, staring out into the darkness as he answered. "Yes." The voice on the other end was soft, feminine, but tinged with concern. "Ethan, where are you? It's late." He closed his eyes for a moment, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Hey, I'm dealing with something. Work. You said you'd be home tonight." "No. But I don't think I'll make it back. It's complicated. The line went silent for a few seconds, and he could feel the disappointment through the phone. Finally she spoke, her voice quieter. All right. Good night. Ethan sighed, but before he could say anything more, the call ended. He stood there, motionless, phone still in hand, the sound of the rain seeming louder now. Domestic trouble. Ethan turned, surprised to hear Thomas's voice. The farmer stood near the table, arms crossed. There was something different in his tone. Not mocking, not confrontational. It's just work, Ethan said, slipping the phone back into his pocket. Nothing major. Thomas tilted his head, as if considering something. Then, with disconcerting precision, he said, I know what the 2 calls you just got were about. Ethan frowned. What are you talking about? In the first call, your informant told you my story, Thomas began. His voice firm but without any hint of accusation. He told you that I had money, that I had everything. And that I lost it all too. He paused, his eyes fixed on Ethan. And the second? That was your family missing you at home. Ethan was left speechless. His mouth slightly open but no words coming out. Thomas took a step forward. His gaze heavy with a kind of understanding that seemed to come from a deeply personal place. I've been in your shoes, Sterling. Work, business, every decision feeling like life or death. And always telling yourself it's for them. That it's to ensure a better future. He let out a short, humorless laugh. Until the day you realize that the future you were trying to build is already gone. Ethan tried to speak, but the lump in his throat stopped him. He looked at Thomas, the man who seemed so unshakable but who now, Ethan understood, had faced something unimaginable. You think money will save you, Thomas continued. His tone serious but not angry. That it will make it all worth it. But let me tell you something, Sterling. In the end, it doesn't buy anything that matters. Those words hung in the air for a long moment. Ethan averted his eyes, staring at the floor as though it might hold an answer. The rain continued to fall, but inside the house, everything was quiet. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan began to reflect on the choices that had brought him here, and the ones still ahead. The night on the farm felt like an eternity. The constant sound of rain was almost hypnotic, a monotonous drumming that echoed in Ethan's mind as he lay on the old couch in the living room. Thomas had retired hours ago, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. He closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come. Thomas's words replayed in his head like a persistent echo. You think money will save you. But in the end, it doesn't buy anything that matters. As much as he wanted to deny it, Ethan knew there was truth in those words. He found himself thinking of his wife, the impatient calls he had ignored, the times he had promised to come home early but hadn't. And most of all, his daughter, the little girl who always asked, "When are we going to spend more time together, Daddy?" He would say someday when work allowed. But would that day come before it was too late? Thomas had also believed he had time. And he lost everything. When dawn finally broke, the rain had subsided into a light drizzle. Ethan woke up before the sun fully rose. Thomas was already outside, inspecting the storm damage as though the previous night had never happened. I'm heading out, Ethan said, leaning against the doorframe as Thomas worked. The farmer glanced over his shoulder and nodded. Good luck, Sterling. There was a moment of silence between them. Ethan opened his mouth, hesitated, and then finally said, "Thank you." Thomas didn't reply. He just went back to work. Ethan climbed into his car and drove away, the soaked dirt road splattering mud against the sides of the SUV. The drive back felt longer than the drive there, but somewhere along the way he made a decision. When Ethan walked into his house, still wearing his muddy shoes, he heard hurried footsteps coming down the stairs. His daughter, Lily, ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist. "Daddy, you're back." Ethan looked at her, feeling the weight of all the times he had neglected moments like this. He crouched down to her level, gently holding her small shoulders. "Hey, sweetheart. Remember that trip you've always asked for?" To Disney. We're going. Her eyes widened, glowing with surprise and excitement. Are you serious? I am, Ethan replied with a smile. We're going in a few days. Daddy just has to wrap up a few things first. Lily let out a joyful squeal, jumping into his arms again. Ethan held her tightly, as if that moment was lifting a burden he hadn't even realized he was carrying. When he looked up, he saw his wife standing in the doorway to the kitchen, watching everything with a confused but warm expression. She slowly approached. Where did this come from? Ethan put Lily down, walked over to his wife, and pulled her into a tight hug. It was the kind of hug that seemed to hold something deeper than words could express. I spent last night realizing that we needed this, he said simply, letting the silence fill the rest. She looked at him for a moment, surprised by the intensity, but chose not to question it. Not at that moment. As Ethan climbed the stairs to take a shower, he paused halfway up, hearing Lily's laughter echo through the house. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly present. The sun had barely begun to rise when Ethan, driven by a restlessness he couldn't ignore, got into his car and headed back to Thomas's farm. The road felt less heavy now, but his mind was still crowded with thoughts. There was something about Thomas that Ethan couldn't let go. A man hiding from the world, imprisoned by a guilt he shouldn't have to bear. When he arrived, he found Thomas in the usual place, near the fence, working on repairs to an old barn that seemed to defy time. As the SUV came to a stop, Thomas paused what he was doing and looked at the visitor with his familiar wary expression. Back again, Sterling, he said, taking off his hat and wiping the sweat from his brow. What's the offer this time? Ethan stepped out of the car, hands in his pockets. His expression wasn't that of a negotiator but of someone carefully choosing his words. I didn't come here to buy your farm, Thomas. Thomas raised an eyebrow, curious but still skeptical. Then why are you here? Ethan took a deep breath, leaning on the fence, his eyes fixed on the ground for a moment before meeting Thomas's gaze. Because I can put myself in your shoes. I understand what you're feeling. And I don't want to take anything from you anymore. Thomas didn't respond but didn't look away either. I know what happened, Ethan continued. I know about the accident. I know what you lost. He paused, carefully choosing his words. And more than that, I know what it's like to live trying to escape the pain. I know how it feels to bury yourself in work, responsibilities, isolation. Anything to avoid facing what really hurts. Thomas tightened his grip on the hammer in his hand but remained silent. But Thomas, Ethan pressed on, you're a good man. And what happened? It was an accident. It wasn't your fault. Punishing yourself, hiding here, isn't going to bring anyone back. Thomas let out a short, dry laugh. Easy to say when it's not your life. Ethan stepped closer, his voice growing firmer. Do you think staying here alone is what they would have wanted for you? Do you think your wife and daughter would be happy knowing you buried yourself in this place because you feel you deserve it? Thomas said nothing, but there was something different in his gaze now. Ethan continued. You still have so much to offer. One of my companies works on social projects, helping communities rebuild and creating opportunities for those who need it most. Someone like you, with your experience, could make a real difference. Thomas crossed his arms, unable to hide his skepticism. Not sure this is the right time. And why do you care so much? Because you lived exactly the way I live, Ethan said, the sincerity in his voice weighing every word. I imagined what happened to you happening to me, and I could feel your pain. He took a deep breath. I almost lost my family because I was too busy to see what really mattered. But I want to change. And so can you. Ethan took a step back, softening his tone. I'm going on a trip in a few days. I'd like you to think about my offer. And if you decide you want to do something different, you know where to find me. Thomas frowned. A work trip. Going to try and buy another farm somewhere else. Ethan smiled, this time genuinely. A trip with my family. Taking my daughter to Disney. Thomas stayed quiet for a moment, then nodded, a faint smile appearing on his lips. That's what it's all about. Ethan waved and returned to his car. He knew he couldn't change Thomas overnight, but he also knew he had planted a seed. And maybe, in time, it would grow. A few weeks later, Ethan was back, renewed. The trip to Disney with his wife and daughter had been more than a break. It had been a reset. He finally felt connected to what mattered. But as soon as he got home, one thought nagged at him: Thomas. He needed to know if the farmer had reflected on his proposal. He got in his car and drove back to the farm. When he arrived, he found Thomas standing near the barn, looking a little more relaxed than the last time but still carrying that resolute demeanor. "Sterling," Thomas said with a nod. "Back to making offers." Ethan stepped out of the car with a genuine smile. "Maybe. I thought you might have considered what we talked about." Thomas motioned for him to come closer. "I did actually. And I think you'll be surprised." Ethan raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "I changed my mind," Thomas said calmly. But before Ethan could celebrate, he continued, "But not about the job. I changed my mind about selling the farm." Ethan froze for a moment, surprised. "Seriously? After all this, you decided to sell?" Thomas nodded, crossing his arms as he glanced around. "There's a lot of good I can do with $50 million, Sterling. I don't know exactly what you saw in this farm, but to me, there are plenty like it. This land was my refuge, my place to figure out what I needed. But now I know I can take that understanding somewhere else." He paused, locking eyes with Ethan. "I'll buy another farm. And with the rest of the money, I'll help other people who've lost everything like I did but don't have the means to rebuild." Ethan stood silent, absorbing Thomas's words. Finally, he smiled and shook his head. "You're a better man than I am, Thomas." Ethan extended his hand, and Thomas clasped it firmly, a gesture of mutual respect. A few years later, Ethan Sterling had found balance. The experience at Thomas's farm had transformed him in ways he couldn't have imagined at the time. He had learned to prioritize his family, to recognize the moments that truly mattered. In recent years, he had divided his time between his business ventures and traveling with his wife and daughter, ensuring that no part of his life was neglected. As for Thomas, Ethan had heard nothing more. No contact, no news. Ethan assumed the man was still in Montana, tending the land, resolute in his choice to live in solitude. Part of him accepted that he might never see Thomas again. But fate had other plans. Ethan was at the airport with his family, waiting to board a flight, this time to explore the beaches of Hawaii. As he helped his daughter adjust her backpack and laughed at one of her silly jokes, something out of the corner of his eye caught his attention. A group of young people entered the terminal, animated, talking and gesturing enthusiastically. They wore simple t-shirts with the name of an organization printed on the front. Ethan almost ignored them until he saw the man leading the group. Thomas Carter. He looked different, more confident, lighter. He wore jeans and a simple shirt, but there was something in his posture that exuded authority and purpose. He smiled as he spoke to the young people, gesturing animatedly and pointing at a schedule board. Ethan stood still for a moment, incredulous, until his daughter called him. "Dad, are you okay?" "Yes, I'll be right back." Leaving his wife and daughter for a moment, Ethan walked toward the group. When he got close enough, he called out, "Thomas." Thomas turned, surprised. When he saw Ethan, his eyes lit up with recognition. "Sterling." The two men stood silently for a moment, processing the coincidence. Then Thomas smiled. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said, shaking Ethan's hand. "Neither did I," Ethan replied, still surprised. "I thought you'd be back at the farm, living in the middle of nowhere." Thomas laughed. "The farm was an important chapter. But, like you said, there was a lot of good I could do with $50 million. He gestured to the young people around him. "These guys. They're part of it. I invest in startups that work to improve people's lives, sustainable tech, social projects, affordable healthcare. These young people are founders and innovators. I'm taking this group to a conference where they'll present their ideas." Ethan looked at the group, impressed. "So, you've become an investor. Something like that, Thomas said with a shrug. It's not about the money. It's about helping, about finding a way to create impact. I've discovered it gives me purpose. Ethan smiled, realizing how much Thomas had changed. You've found your path. And you? Thomas asked. Still trying to buy farms around the world. Ethan chuckled. Oh, though I still run my businesses, I always take a few vacations a year to travel the world with my family. I'm learning that it's not about what I build but about who I share it with. Thomas nodded, his smile subtle but sincere. That's what it's all about. The two shook hands one more time, exchanging a final look of mutual respect before Thomas returned to his group and Ethan rejoined his family. As Ethan watched Thomas walk away, he felt something rare, a deep sense of peace. They were different men with different lives, but somehow they had helped each other find what truly mattered.
If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to the channel. There's more to come. Leave a comment with your thoughts about the story and rate it from 0 to 10. Thank you so much.